Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We'll be getting started in 1 minute. Thank you so much. And while we're waiting to get started, I'm going to switch the screen so you can see my screen. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you happen to be. My name's Keith Wheatman. I am the principal of Level 3 by Design. And today we're going to focus on healing and hope. It's one of the ways in which we help our clients to catch the spark. And in this particular case, it's really focusing on faith. So what our company does is we help leaders hone leadership skills. There are specific kind of skills around how do you affect change, how do you unleash creativity, and how do you empower people. So let me tell you a little bit about my story as it relates to my faith and my work. So my faith led me to helping people. I thought that was what I was supposed to do as a good Christian. And then in 1986, while I was a county welfare director in Montgomery County, which is Crawfordsville, Indiana, I was walking down the street heading back from a trip to Roslyn Bakery, one of my favorite places to go in the morning. And on my way back to the office, it was like somebody suddenly dropped a brick on my head. I suddenly remembered they had a vision of a county welfare system that truly works for everyone. And here I was getting ready to leave a position without ever having done one thing to make that vision a reality. At the time I was in graduate school. So I was working full-time during the day, and I was in graduate school at night, getting clinical training and how to affect change in people. And I found myself through the course of this 2-year training, and the clinical training went along with it, where I used all my vacation time, clinical training. I found myself naturally taking the ideas I was learning about affecting change in people and looking at, well, how do you use these ideas to affect change in the welfare system? By the time I had my degree, I believed it was possible to transform our nation's welfare system. Then in 1988, I made a commitment to do one thing each day toward creating a welfare system that truly works for everyone. That turned into a journey that lasted until 1996. And during the course of those years, it was like holding 2-time jobs. One was a traditional job that I got paid for as a county director. The other one was a second full-time job where I was not paid with monetary compensation. It was all about making a difference by engaging people that normally were not involved in the system, with the system, and engaging those who were dependent upon assistance to be partners in a shared endeavor to create a system that truly works for everyone. One of the interesting things that happened to me was I got hooked up with a pastor by the name of John Stacy. And he was someone who was a pastor of a different church, and yet he became very committed as a partner to the endeavor that we made to transform the welfare system. And what was the most interesting to me was over the course from 89 to 96, he actually mentored me, and he rekindled my faith in God by telling parables from the Bible, sharing parables with me that paralleled the work that we were doing. Every time we would have what I would call a miracle, making a positive difference in the life of someone who was on assistance, pastor would often share a story. It was a biblical story where there was parallel learnings and lessons. So then in 2012, I had another brick fall upon my head. I was talking with somebody who was a local community leader, and he was nudging me to do something. He nudged me once, and I was flattered, and I didn't do anything. 30 days later, I saw him after the same meeting, and he nudged me a second time. The second nudge got me to really think about what I want to do for the rest of my career. And today I'm doing exactly what I want to do. And if you look there, you can see it looks like I'm holding a lightning bolt. I have a true confession to make. It's trick photography. I do not know how to hold a lightning bolt. What I do know how to do is I know how to empower people. And when you empower someone, you can say it's first like being a spark, and then the more effective you become, it can be like holding a friggin' lightning bolt. And that's what we're going to talk more about today as it relates to our faith. So early on in my journey to create a system that works for everyone, I used to call my parents several times each week. Each time I would call them, I would share with them a success story. One day I would call and say, I'm so excited, Mom and Dad, I talked with the mayor of Crawfordsville, Indiana, and he's going to be personally involved in our work. The next day I might call and say, Mom and Dad, I am just so excited. I talked with the CEO of Ray Bestis Enterprises, and he's agreed to be personally involved in our work as well. Then 2 months after I'd started calling my parents, celebrating all the excitement, and you know how parents are, they get excited with their children. My father got a game, a psychology board game that he invented when he was a young man in his 20s, out of the attic. He then transformed that psychology game into a program to help young people learn to think, reason, and solve problems without violence by asking open-ended questions. My father then traveled around the country between the ages of 70 and 80, and he taught people, adults who work with juvenile delinquents and adults who work with adult offenders, how to facilitate group discussions and use positive peer influence to help people learn to think, reason, and solve problems without violence. My father's work culminated in presenting at 2 national conferences. One was in Atlanta, Georgia for the juvenile justice system in the United States. The other one's in Toronto, Canada for the juvenile justice system in Canada. So I cannot tell you how many people's lives my father touched through the work that he did. I can only assure you that it was many. And then what was really neat and exciting to me was you could say that my father was called to serve our community and our country in a very special way. And he served it with passion, and he served it with enthusiasm. And I know he made a difference. And my mother used to accompany my father on his trips around the country. And she was often in the room with him. And so my dad would lead, and my mother would be there to support him in the work that they did together. So you could say it was quite an unusual retirement. And I can assure you that both of my parents were very satisfied and fulfilled with the work that they did. So let's now focus for just a moment about you and your story. What drew you to sign up for today's webinar? How will you, in the future, respond to God's calling to serve the poor? I'm going to ask you to keep this second question open, and we'll ask you again the same question at the end of this webinar. I do want to thank all of you for your engagement today. So here's a few questions for you to think about. These questions are around healing and hope. Can our nation's social welfare system be transformed by people of faith without any changes in the federal or state laws that govern the system? Can we build meaningful relationships, empowering interpersonal relationships across socioeconomic boundaries? Can we, you and I, take ownership for and have great pride in our nation's welfare system? So here are the outcomes for today's webinar. I'm going to provide you with a useful way of understanding our nation's welfare system and why the current system still does not work. Yes, in spite of welfare reform, what I'm telling you today is that our welfare system still does not truly work. 2, I'm going to connect our welfare system's failure with our personal shortfalls as children of God. 3rd, I'm going to help you unleash your God-given gift to empower poor people and one another. And 4th, I'm going to invite you to partner with me in transforming our nation's welfare system into one that truly works for everyone by treating poor people as God would want for us to do. Sound good? Well, let's get going. So, food for thought to start with. There was once a thought leader by the name of Jose Arguelles. He once said, quote, "The failure of Christian civilization or any other has been in its inability to live by the example of its teachers," end quote. So I invite you to consider the possibility that our failure or our shortfall as a Christian civilization has been in our inability to take core Christian values of love, acceptance, care, compassion, forgiveness, and being non-judgmental, and adopting those values as consistently as our Father did. So my training was actually in something called the disciplined practice of constructivist thinking. I'm going to take you today on a fork in the road, down the fork of this disciplined practice. I'm going to connect this disciplined practice to the faith that you and I share. So before we leave the traditional fork, though, I want to talk for a moment about the fork that we're leaving. From this traditional fork, knowledge provides us with accurate information about the world in which we live. Scientific theories that hold up to rigorous experimentation are considered to be proven. In other words, discoveries about how the world actually works. And perceiving is considered to be a passive act. In other words, our five senses provide us with an accurate picture of the world as it truly is. And we live our lives as if the way we see it is the way the world is. We assume no responsibility for the impact of our critical judgments upon poor people who receive public assistance. And while we may confess our sins each week at church, we are often not aware of when and how our actions are inconsistent with our faith and faith-related values. So here's a little bit about this big word, constructivism. If you look there on the left-hand side, you'll see that there is a graph. At the top of the graph, you'll see philosophy. And then below that in the chart, you'll see psychology on the right, science in the middle, and epistemology on the left-hand side. And then below epistemology, you'll see the word constructivism. So first, epistemology is the study or a theory of the nature and grounds of knowledge, especially as it relates to its limits and validity. And then constructivism is a specific theory about epistemology that reality cannot be known with certainty. All that can be known with certainty is what reality is not. So you might recognize the face in the picture. It's Albert Einstein. And you could say that Dr. Einstein was on this road less traveled. One of the things he once said was that no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong. By holding on to this mindset of a true scientist, Albert Einstein was able to come up with theories that actually contradicted earlier theories that he'd experimented and had not disproven. So really what I'm inviting you to do is take the mindset of a scientist, a true scientist, and apply it outside of the field of science. And when you do, you'll get that reality can't be known with certainty. All we can know with certainty is what reality is not. So another way of thinking about this, I want you to think about the knowledge, and we're talking about mankind's knowledge here, not knowledge from the Bible, that mankind's knowledge more or less fits reality. It is not an exact match. This knowledge can be used selectively when useful in achieving a result. Knowledge, like beliefs, can also be limiting. You and I can actually set aside limiting knowledge and limiting beliefs instead of letting it constrain ourselves or others. So let me give you an example. When I was in graduate school, I studied child development. What I learned about personality is your personality is pretty much locked in by the age of 4. At the time I was in graduate school, I was about 35 years old. So that means that my personality was pretty much locked in. And at the time, at the age of 35, I was shy. Let me assure you, a shy personality is not a good fit for doing the work that I do today. So for me, it was more useful to set aside shyness and not see it as something that was locked in by the age of 4. And when I set it aside, it opened up new possibilities, like me leading this training for you today, this webinar, Blending Healing and Hope. So another way of thinking about the discipline practice is really focusing on a gift that we have. It's a gift from God, and the gift is that we can perceive creatively. Another way of saying this is actually owning perceiving as a creative act. Yes, it does involve our 5 senses, and it's always influenced by our knowledge, by our beliefs, and by our past experiences. And then you and I have the God-given capability to perceive any person or any situation at any moment in more than one way. So let me share with you some lessons that I learned from someone named Lewis. A few years ago, I was the executive director of a free clinic called Volunteers in Medicine. It was actually the most fulfilling job that I ever had in my life, other than doing what I do today. And one of the people that I met, one of the patients at Volunteers in Medicine, his name was Lewis. Lewis was one of the strongest Christians that I have ever met in my life. Lewis also happened to be poor. And yet Lewis did not see himself as poor. Lewis actually saw himself as blessed. Each time he came in the clinic, he would typically stop in my office and we'd talk for a few minutes. And he would share with me about his faith journey. And typically what he would share about is how he was blessed and how his family was blessed. And I can assure you that the amount of financial wealth that he had was far less than the clients that I work with typically today. And yet from Lewis's vantage point, Lewis was completely fulfilled in his faith in God and in one another. So here is a quick test about perceiving creatively. What I invite you to do is read what you see inside the triangle to yourself. I once shared this same slide with 500 educators in the state of Illinois. They were all very intelligent educators. Most of them had master's degrees, and they certainly all had bachelor's degrees. And there was not a single person in the room that saw that the phrase in the triangle was not Paris in the spring, but actually Paris in the spring. And what this does is it gives you a quick example of how we perceive creatively. We see what we expect to see, and we tend to be blind to things that are inconsistent with what we expect. So what does this perceiving have to do with our nation's welfare system? Well, let me show you an artist's metaphor for what's wrong with our welfare system as it relates to how people perceive that system. So if you'll notice there's 3 people, and there's 2 people pointing a finger at the third. And let me first focus on the finger being pointed at the people that are clients of our system. And the 2 entities pointing the fingers are taxpayers. That would be you and me, the taxpayers of our world, and also government, the people who serve the taxpayers. So let me now do a little bit of artist interpreting the metaphor. And really interpreting the metaphor is all about how we fall short in biblical teachings. Matthew 7, chapter 7, verse 1 is judge that ye not be judged. Let me assure you that in my years working with our nation's welfare system, that there was no lack of people critically judging other people. So you could say the general public critically judges the clients. The general public critically judges government. Clients critically judge the general public. Clients critically judge government. And then government also critically judges both the general public and clients. So let me share with you some of these critical judgments as they are shared by people who are success stories. So these are people who I used to work with that have made such big strides in their lives that we featured them in the newspaper as a success story. We always ask them to share about how did the community get in the way of their success. One of them said, whose name was Lisa, said it was hard being criticized by others when she used food stamps at the grocery store. Quote, "I don't think people realize how much it hurts. I still feel kind of small," end quote. Another person said humiliation makes you very bitter in the welfare system. You get very defensive. Another one said it's hard to believe in yourself when many people are critical of people on welfare. And then another said, I had a chip on my shoulder because of welfare. There's so much frustration and humiliation. I get upset when people say those on welfare are lazy. So now let's shift focus. And the source of this is an Ivy Tech survey dated all the way back to 19 1990. These are the government's critical judgments of those served, the clients. She kept demanding that I called her Mrs. Grace, and she refused to call me Mrs. Brewer. Made you feel worthless, that you had to beg. She acted like she didn't want to be bothered. She treated me like I was less than a person. They act like you are dirt. They don't give people hope or desire for change. They help people stay dependent. Now, in case you're concerned about how dated that information is, let me say two things to you. For the last 3 years, I've been volunteering 2 sessions a month working with a program called Bartholomew County Works. Bartholomew County Works serves people that are receiving public assistance in helping them turn their lives around. Let me assure you that these comments are not dated. And to put it another way, let's move back in time to 1957. And this is from a book put out by the American Public Welfare Association in 1957. Quote, "We need to reiterate that these clients are made less adequate, not more adequate, when the community kicks them. That incentive is lost when there's a feeling of helplessness, and that self-esteem and a way out are lost when there is only negative criticism." Another quote, "We need to think preventively with a willingness to experiment and carefully observe results." Another quote, "Encouragement of citizen participation is a legitimate and important function of public welfare leadership." So given that it is an important component, citizen participation, let me ask you, in what way are you involved as a participant in supporting the success of your local community's welfare system today? So now let me tell you the story of Mark. And before I tell you the story, let me tell you a little bit about Mark and about what I used to think. I used to believe that 10% of the people who received public assistance were really, truly bad apples. And those 10% were such bad apples that they actually created a negative image for everyone who received public assistance. So let me tell you a little bit about what I knew about Mark at the time I had a confrontation with him. I knew that Mark had once attacked a detective from behind with a knife. I knew that Mark had served hard times and was a felony convicted prisoner, served time in prison. I knew that he was very dangerous. I knew that whenever police received a report, and Mark was involved in the report, that the police always sent 2 squad cars. At the time, 2 squad cars meant 4 officers, because they knew if Mark was involved in a domestic disturbance, chances are they were going to need lots of people involved. And I knew that Mark also had some issues with anger and violence. So the confrontation, it was during one of the first 3 working days in the month, and our lobby was filled with people picking up their food stamp benefits. There was a loud commotion in the lobby. There was a man whose voice was raised. And I was the county director, so I left my office and immediately rushed to the scene to step in and intervene. And typically what would happen when I would step in and intervene is people would immediately calm down because I was an authority figure. I was the county director. So I stepped in to intervene, and I found myself face to face with Mark. It was my first personal encounter with Mark. And let me assure you, it was not a pleasant one. Mark said either I was going to give him his food stamps or he was going to knock the tar out of me, except he didn't use the word tar. He was very violent, he was very hostile, and he was very aggressive when he spoke. So I immediately thought, well, let me get him out of the lobby and into my office. So I got him out of the lobby, took him into my office, and I closed both doors. So now there was just me and Mark in my office and a desk sitting between us. For the next 90 minutes, I had the most stressful experience of my life because the conversation for much of the 90 minutes went something like this. If I didn't give him his food stamps, he was going to knock the tar out of me. And then I told him, well, if he knocks the tar out of me, I was going to have him arrested. And I tried to explain to him that I couldn't just give him his food stamps because his benefits had expired. In order to get more food stamps, he had to go back through an application process to be recertified to receive food stamps. Otherwise, it would be theft, it would be a crime, and he could be criminally charged and convicted. So this conversation went on for 90 minutes, and at times Mark got quite tense, and I must say that my armpits were pouring down sweat. In fact, it seemed as if they were like a stream flowing down from each of my armpits as my shirt got totally soaked, and my sport coat over my shirt actually began to get soaked too. But I managed to use my very best skills that day, and I was able to get out of that meeting without getting the tar knocked out of me. And I also got out of the meeting without having him walk out the door with food stamps. What we finally did was we negotiated for a settlement. I worked for him. I established an opportunity for him to come in a couple of days for a special appointment to reestablish his eligibility and then get his food stamps later that week. So then when he came back in to get his food stamps, it was interesting. It was as if we had bonded from that really intense experience, and we were actually friendly with one another. So when he came in 30 days later to get his food stamps, I started thinking, now I've been going through this training, and I had an 8-day course, 64 hours of training, and it was all about what's possible. So I thought to myself, what's possible for Mark? So I approached Mark, and we small talked for a minute, very friendly with each other. And then I popped the question, would you be interested in me helping you get a job? So Mark then proceeded. We had about a 5-minute conversation, and he explained to me why he did not want to do janitorial work, because janitorial work was beneath him. He also didn't want to work in a factory because, in his opinion, factory jobs were too hot and too tiring, standing on your feet all day. He decided that day that the only thing he wanted to do, he thought it'd be really cool to drive around town in a bread truck. So he left that day, letting me know that he wanted to get a job driving a bread truck. After he left, I thought about what he said. And I thought, here's a guy with a felony conviction. Here's a guy with an anger or violence issue. And all he's willing to do is drive a bread truck. So I decided he's too picky, and I didn't do anything. So Mark came in 30 days later to pick up his benefits again. Once again, I bumped into him in the lobby, and we had a small talk conversation. And then this time, Mark popped the question for me. He said, how's his job search going? He asked me how his job search is going. So I told him, I said, I haven't done anything. And he said, well, why not? And I said, well, you're too picky. He said, what do you mean I'm too picky? And I said, you won't work in a factory. Just like that, he looked at me and he said, without hesitating, I'll work in a factory. I didn't get Mark a job. I got him an interview. And then Mark performed so well in the interview that a foreman decided to take a chance and hire him. Then I started getting weekly phone calls from the HR manager at the plant where Mark had gone to work. And the phone calls went something like this. Mark is really shining in this job. Mark is knocking himself out to impress his supervisor. Mark is outperforming everybody on the line. So I saw Mark 30 days later. I said, I want to take you to lunch. I want to acknowledge you for the positive steps you made to change your life. And that was where, for the first time, I saw another side of Mark. I found out Mark was totally uncomfortable going into a restaurant. He was uncomfortable because he always thought people were looking at him. So you could say he was paranoid. And I did get him to go to lunch with me, but sure enough, throughout the entire lunch hour, Mark would take his glance and shift it from to see who was looking at him. What Mark didn't see, and I later, after the fact, is that his way of behaving in the restaurant actually drew people's attention to him. So you could say it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. He feared that people would look at him. He was paranoid people were going to look at him. And then by his actions, he caused people to do the very thing that he was paranoid of. So Mark kept that job for over 12 months, and then Mark lost the job. But the interesting thing that happened was Mark never came back into the office to apply for food stamps. So 10 years went by, and I changed jobs. I was now working 90 minutes away, actually an hour and 45 minutes away, and I'd stopped at a local gas station to pick up a cup of coffee. It's 5:30 in the morning, and I want to stay awake for the road trip. 45 minutes, an hour and 45 minutes away. And who do I bump into when I'm getting my cup of coffee? I see Mark for the first time in 10 years. I look at Mark, he looks like he's dressed like a regular workaday Joe, and I ask him, what's he doing? He said he's on his way to work at a different local factory. Mark had changed his life and demonstrated for me what is possible when we give people a second look. So here are something, what I was really trained in at first was what's called assumptions, useful assumptions. So here's some useful assumptions that I used when I was working with Mark many years ago. One is that change is always possible. Another is that people are interested in and capable of becoming self-sufficient in spite of first impressions to the contrary. And then a third was that people get stuck in a reactive dance, reacting to being critically judged by others in a very dysfunctional way. And then the fourth assumption I had is that miracles can happen. If you'll notice, I've got parentheses around the word miracles, because what appears to be a miracle to me may not actually be a true miracle. But let me assure you that the way in which Mark responded was like a miracle to me. So it's interesting, when you look up the definition of assumption, 1A in the dictionary is an assumption is the lifting up of a person into heaven. And what I mean by assumption is the taking for granted without proof that something is true. And yet most people do not use assumptions. And these donkeys have something to do with why most people don't use assumptions. See, most people have heard the term that when you make an assumption, you make an ASS out of you and me. And most people have had experiences where they made an ASS out of themselves when they made an assumption that wasn't true. So most people are leery of using assumptions in their work. And yet I want you to know that when used properly and thoughtfully, assumptions can be one of the most powerful things that we can use. So you could say that what I did with Mark was I empowered him. And here's what I mean by empowering someone. I'm talking about expanding someone's personal experience of their capabilities and choices, and causing someone to take action to realize those capabilities or choices. So in Mark's world, before he and I met, I do not believe that he thought it was possible, given his criminal record and given his personality, if you will, that he could ever hold a job in a factory. And another thing about empowerment, you could say when it comes to empowering people, that you and I are like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, wearing the ruby slippers. That you and I have always had the capacity to empower people. And it's a much greater capacity than you and I have ever exercised. Or to put things in another way, Michael Landon played Jonathan, Highway to Heaven. And his buddy Mark used to say, you got the stuff. You and I have got the stuff to empower other people. And we can empower other people by the way in which we see them and then treat them. So here are some quotes from success stories about the experience of being empowered by others. Here's one. It makes all the difference when people believe in you enough to make you believe in yourself. Here's another. Their caring worked. I did it. And here's another. People were believing in an ability that I didn't see. If Keith saw something that I didn't see, then it must be there because I trust his judgment. So that was spoken by a client whose first name was Yvette. And Yvette, at the time that I met her, her children were in the child welfare system. And she was sharing with me her mental health diagnosis. I was so impressed by how well she could describe her mental health diagnosis to me and its implications upon her life. My conclusion was she must be quite smart, because at the time I was taking a course on how you diagnose people. She's got this diagnosis nailed. At the time, she thought her brain was dead. So I started encouraging her and connecting her with other resources. Before long, she had a team of people that were working with her. One was working for a welfare to work program. Another one was an adult educator. Another was a tutor. And another was a mentor. Everyone was supporting Yvette in getting to where she wanted to get to. So Yvette at the time was a high school dropout, and she went back to school to get her high school equivalency degree. It was not an easy journey for her. She really struggled with math. Yet with both a mentor and a tutor, she eventually got her high school equivalency. She didn't stop there though. She went on and got a 2-year degree in human services. And then before I left that community, Yvette was working full-time in a domestic violence shelter, the very same domestic violence shelter where she had once stayed to escape domestic violence. So here is a picture. On the left, you'll see at the time Crawfordsville Mayor Phil Michael, who was also a mentor in our community's mentoring program. And walking along beside him on the right is a young man by the name of Michael Burge. I knew who Michael was before he met the mayor. And I noticed the very first day they were together, it was at a full day training. And the very first day they were together, where the mayor picked Michael up to go to the training together, Michael's body posture shifted in a very positive way. Having a mayor take a personal interest in him shifted how he saw himself. I can tell you that Michael went on to get his high school equivalency degree, and then went on and got a job, first job in a factory, and then he wound up getting a promotion, and he was a foreman in a faucet manufacturing company, plating faucets, and he was also in a rock and roll band in the weekends. The last time I wrote a story about what he was up to, about 6 years after he met the mayor. So he'd adopted a middle-class lifestyle where he's making a good income supporting his family, and he also had a hobby, like many people, like you and I do. He was in a rock and roll band. His rock and roll band had actually won a competition, and they were going to be going to Nashville, Tennessee to have one of their songs recorded. A pretty awesome experience. And I can assure you that his life changed in part because a mayor took a personal interest in him and became his friend and mentor. So another one of the people I used to work with had an artistic talent. She was a client, she was receiving assistance, and she was striving to better herself. And she also caught this spark about wanting to help other people better themselves too. So she became the editor for a newsletter called The Catalyst, and she created this logo to symbolize the work that they did. It was all about helping people catch the spark and be who they're capable of being. And she called that spark Sparky. So she, for 3 years, was a volunteer with a newsletter that came out almost every month, and also was a volunteer in starting a group. In fact, she was the leader of a group that formed the Catalyst Food Bank. The Catalyst Food Bank was consisting of about 12 people who were all volunteers, and they had all were either currently on food stamps or had formerly been on food stamps. And so they really appreciated how important it was that when a family applies for food stamps, that they be able to access food while they're waiting for their food stamp benefits to be approved. And that at the same time they could access food, that they also be treated with dignity and respect. So they started a food bank, and they ran it for 5 years, all volunteers. And this particular picture on the left is Betty. She was a volunteer at the food bank, and she's receiving a $500 check from a local businessman to start the food bank that they ran for 5 years, all volunteers. Now, the Catalyst Food Bank thought it was important to have a presence in the Christmas parade. So if you look here, you can see they don't have a very fancy float, but I can assure you that the children that were on that float loved being in the Christmas parade. And then you can see there a picture of Barb walking alongside the float, one of the really key volunteers in the work that we were doing. And you can see the pride in her strut, that she, like Mike, took great pride in her volunteer work. And she also took great pride in her work as she became self-sufficient. She was another success story. So 3 years into our endeavor, we had involved someone who was the vice chair of the Democratic Party for our particular county. And our governor came to visit our county for Capital for the Day. So our volunteer persuaded the governor's people, you just got to come and see what we're doing to make an effect upon our welfare system here in Montgomery County, Indiana. So the governor came to our 3-year celebration, and he was so empowered by his experience of what he saw there that he walked out of the room and he told his direct reports, I want to do this in every county in the state of Indiana. And that was the beginning of the seed of what became Governor Evan Bayh's Welfare Reform Initiative. The next step was a 3-county pilot project. In this photograph, he has his right arm on the shoulder of Betty Knox. Betty Knox was a mentor in our community's mentoring program. But Betty Knox really touched the governor in a different way. You see, Betty used to be on public assistance herself. And so she became interested because she had a true compassion. She understood what it was like to be on assistance, and she knew there was a way out. You could say there's no better role model for someone on assistance than someone who's been there and done that and found a way out. And yet at most communities, there's so much critical judgments about those that have been on assistance that few people will do what Betty did and stand up and say, let me volunteer and let me lead the way for others, because I've been there and I've done that and I can help. So I want you to know that the more we practice this gift, the more we can hone our skills to empower people. It's actually possible to empower people with a minimal investment of time or effort. So in my more recent years, after having quite a bit of time honing my skills, I was a volunteer, actually as the executive director of Volunteers in Medicine. And I took a personal interest in each patient that we served. And in taking that personal interest, if I saw an opportunity to make a difference in a 5 or 10 minute conversation, then I'd have one. So I remember a young man who came into the clinic for the first time. He came into the clinic, he was 21 years old, he had his grandmother and his mother with him. The reason his grandmother and mother were there with him was he was so paranoid about being out in public. He had such great fear of having a panic attack that he brought the 2 of them with him for moral support. He actually believed he was going to need to live the rest of his life with this incredible fear of being out in public. I knew enough about mental health to know that a phobia is something that can easily be overcome. So that day I invested an extra 5 or 10 minutes in letting this young man know that his phobia could be overcome. And I referred him to a local community mental health center called Centerstone to get treatment. 2 months later, this young man popped his head into my office at the clinic. He just wanted me to know that he was now going out in public by himself. He was in therapy and he was making great strides, and he just wanted to let me know that he was making these strides, and he wanted to say thank you. Then on the right-hand side, I had a young woman that I met, and she was 1 week away from graduating from a drug treatment program. She had had a serious drug addiction and had a felony conviction on her record as a result of her drug addiction. Her concern at the time I met with her is that no one will ever give me a chance because of her felony conviction. And at the time, she was 1 week away from graduating from a program where, in order to stay out of jail or prison after she graduates, she's going to need to have a job right away to be able to pay court fees for the various monitoring and things that it would take for her to stay out of jail or prison. She totally lacked confidence in her ability to get a job. So I invested an extra 5 or 10 minutes that day, and I coached her on the difference between trying to get a job and actually getting one. 30 days later, I was with a group of people from our free clinic, and we were at a quality restaurant ordering our lunch. The waitress took our order, walked 6 steps away from the table, and then suddenly turned around and walked back to our table and walked right up to me. And she shared with me, I just want to thank you for coaching me on the difference between trying to get a job and getting a job. I wanted you to know you made a difference in my life. And I also want you to know I've taught my 2 adult children the difference between trying to get a job and getting one. So you could say we all live our life like we live in a box. And the box represents what's possible for us. And that you and I have the ability to break out of whatever box that we're living in ourselves. And we also have the ability to empower other people to break out of their box as to what's possible for them too. And when we do this, it's empowering to both parties. So there's a woman named Marianne Williamson who was very well known in the Christian ministry world. And she once said, we're all meant to shine as children do. And if you look here, you'll see a photograph of a baby shining. And then I've got a quote from an entrepreneur that I'm working with in South Africa. And he says, thank you ever so kindly, Keith. I like the response. You can't see my eyes now, but they are gleaming like a torch. And he and I both knew what he meant by that. The social media message that I had sent him had caused him to have that empowering experience. And he wanted me to know that he had it. So he let me know that his eyes were gleaming like a torch. So from a faith-based perspective, you could say that each person is a child of God, made in God's image, with gifts for humanity still hidden within. So each and every person receiving public assistance today has a gift for humanity still hidden within. And faith-based leadership then is about helping people unleash more of their hidden gifts. A quote from Scripture that is relevant here: with God, all things are possible. So when we have faith in God and in God's creations, which would be people, including people who receive public assistance, then that faith can be effective in helping someone else to expand their horizons about what's possible. In fact, if you like, you can think of it as a transformational change. You all know about how a monarch caterpillar goes into a cocoon and emerges as a butterfly. Well, we human beings have an ability to shine. And perhaps we are not as beautiful as a butterfly, but when we shine like a baby, we are contagious because people love to be around those of us when we shine. And it's not just those on assistance that we can help to shine. So here's a call to action, my invitation to you. I invite you to make a commitment to invest 1 hour each week if you can. If you can't do it every week, then once a month, in building relationships across socioeconomic boundaries. One of the ways you can do this is you can become a volunteer tutor for an adult education program to help people obtain a high school equivalency degree. Or you could volunteer at a hot meals site or a food pantry where you have an opportunity to interact with those in need. If you happen to live in Bartholomew County, Indiana, then I encourage you to consider becoming an iGrad volunteer, mentor, or tutor. iGrad is all about each and every young person graduating from high school, and volunteer mentors or tutors are very essential to the success of those who are financially disadvantaged and otherwise disadvantaged. Or you can invite your minister to participate in a 1 hour, one-to-one interactive webinar with me on this topic, healing and hope. And then I invite you to keep a log of any noteworthy observations to share with your faith family. Our minister likes to refer to those of us that are members of the congregation as being a faith family. So I'm sharing that with you. So I want to thank you and I want to acknowledge you. It is such a privilege for me today to have this opportunity to provide this training for you. I do have a final call to action. I invite you to provide me with helpful feedback about this webinar. How you can do this is you can send me an email at keith@level3bydesign.com. That's Keith, Keith, at level, Level, the number 3 by design.com. So it's been great. It has been such a privilege to provide this training for you today through this webinar technology. I encourage and invite you to join me in effecting a true reform of our nation's welfare system by joining me as a person of faith, recognizing our ability to make a difference. Thank you so much, and have a great day.